are now going to share some of the key findings of the report. Before we do that, we thought it might be helpful if I just briefly share some of our reasons for writing this report. Now, this report is relevant to churches of all denominations. But while several churches have already fully divested from fossil fuels, some other churches, such as the Methodist Church and the Church of England, have said that they would complete divestment from oil and gas companies whose business investment plans are not aligned with the Paris Agreement by a particular date. 2020 in the case of the Methodist Church and 2023 in the case of the Church of England. I'm now going to share some slides with you, so hopefully this will work. Okay, so the first section of the report focuses on the church and the climate emergency, and I think Bokani is going to kick us off on this one.
Sure. So this first section focuses on how the church has been responding to the climate emergency, and very much to pick up from Martin's point, several churches in the UK have recognised and declared a climate emergency. We're waking up to the need for an ecological conversion that Pope Francis spoke about in Laudato Si. And in recent years, we've seen increasingly severe climate impacts with disproportionate impacts on the world's poorest communities. I'm sure you'll all remember the Australian wildfires toward the end of last year, the UK storms in February, that caused some of the worst winter flooding in recent times, as well as Cyclone Idai, which devastated the city of Beira in Mozambique. So how are churches responding to that growing climate crisis? There's been some positive steps which have already been taken. Some churches have already fully divested from fossil fuels, and we'll hear a lot more about that in the latter part of this presentation. And in addition, action has been taken in other ways. For example, the Church of England has set a 2030 net zero target, and 20 out of 22 Catholic dioceses have already switched to renewable energy.
So under the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which 195 countries signed up to in December 2015, nations agreed to limit global average temperature rises to well below 2 degrees and to strive for 1.5 degrees in order to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. Since then, we've become even more aware of the need to limit temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, published a special report on 1.5 degrees in October 2018. Which showed the huge differences between limiting global average temperature rises to 1.5 degrees compared with 2 degrees. For example, limiting temperature rises to 1.5 degrees would significantly reduce the risk of severe and extreme weather events, especially heat waves and heat-related mortality. It would mean that half as many people would be exposed to water scarcity, and it would prevent runaway sea level rise that could submerge many of the world's islands.
Now, this may seem quite technical, but as UN Climate Chief Christina Figueres has said, when it comes to rises in global average temperature, every fraction of a degree matters. Furthermore, with increasing temperature, there's a greater risk of triggering tipping points, such as the melting of the permafrost. The IPCC report also showed that we need to reduce carbon emissions by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 in order to meet the 1.5 degree target. However, emissions have continued to rise since then, and the 2019 UN emissions gap report showed that we need to reduce emissions by 55% between 2018 and 2030. The UN emissions gap report also made clear that without urgent action to cut emissions, the 1.5 degree target would slip out of reach. So the decisions we make in the next 12 to 18 months and in the next decade are crucial, especially in the context of the recovery plans which are being decided by our governments now.
So an important question has arisen in recent years. How do we measure whether oil and gas companies are aligned with the Paris Agreement targets? This table comes from our report, and as you can see, there are various metrics on which we can measure whether oil and gas companies are aligned with the Paris Agreement, and they are falling short on every one. The Transition Pathway Initiative, a project launched by the Church of England and supported by several churches, including the Methodist Church, found in its 2020 State of Transition report that of the 5 largest publicly listed oil companies, only Shell was aligned with the Paris pledges, or the nationally determined contributions, which are the pledges that were made by governments ahead of the UN climate talks in Paris. But it's important to note that the Paris pledges are not to be confused with the Paris Agreement targets, since the Paris pledges, or nationally determined contributions, would lead to 2.9 to 3.4 degrees of warming, thus triggering feedback loops which would cause even further warming. Whereas the Paris Agreement targets aim to limit global average temperature rises to well below 2 degrees and aim for 1.5 degrees.
So many of you will be aware that some churches, including the Church of England, are pursuing a strategy of shareholder engagement with oil and gas companies. However, this engagement has not brought about a sufficiently rapid move towards achieving these Paris Agreement targets and has had only very limited success. And here's some of those reasons for why. A report in the Financial Times on research from Global Witness showed that the oil and gas industry is planning to spend nearly $5 trillion on the exploration and extraction of new reserves in the next decade, none of which is compatible with the Paris Agreement targets. And we know that the vast majority of known fossil fuel reserves must remain in the ground if we are to meet those targets. And that's what scientists are saying, financial leaders like Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, and faith leaders, including Pope Francis. In fact, when Pope Francis met with CEOs of major oil companies in 2018, he stressed that, and quote, even more worrying is the continued search for new fossil fuel reserves, whereas the Paris Agreement clearly urged keeping most fossil fuels in the ground. He said, civilization requires energy, but energy must not destroy civilization.
And I think Pope Francis could have said exactly the same quote today. Even if capital expenditure has fallen in the short term as a result of COVID-19, major oil companies are likely to go back to these plans as soon as the economic recovery allows. And to give just one example, even at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in April, Shell approved a $6.4 billion project in Australia. Now, in the last couple of years, some oil companies have announced plans to reduce the emissions intensity of their products or reach net zero emissions by a particular date. Now, it's important to note that when an oil and gas company, could reduce its emissions intensity, that is the emissions per unit of energy that a company sells, while at the same time increasing its overall emissions. Several oil companies have announced their non-binding ambitions to reach net zero emissions by 2050. while at the same time planning to continue producing huge volumes of oil and gas for decades to come. These companies hope to reach net zero emissions by relying on offsetting schemes and carbon dioxide removal technologies such as carbon capture and storage, which are unproven for large-scale deployment and may not be economically viable. The CEO of French oil company Total, Patrick Pouyanné, similar to many other oil company CEOs, told Reuters in February this year, "We don't want to go away from oil and gas. Society wants to be carbon neutral, but the energy companies will not be carbon neutral." And if you look at this graph on the right-hand side, you can see that all of the major oil companies are planning to significantly increase oil and gas production in the next decade, including Shell by 38% and BP by 20%, while global emissions need to halve by 2030 in order to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees.
Now, you'll often hear oil companies declaring their commitment to the Paris Agreement, and yet last year, the Guardian report on research by InfluenceMap showed that the 5 largest publicly listed oil companies are spending $200 million per year on lobbying to block, control, and delay climate policies. Alongside these lobbying activities, huge sums are spent on misleading advertising that give the impression that oil companies are transforming into renewable energy companies. In reality, major oil companies planned to spend an average of just 3% of their capital expenditure on low carbon projects in 2019. In another Financial Times interview, Total CEO Patrick Pouyanné said that the investing in renewables was part of the way to make the oil and gas business acceptable. Quote, "It's only 5% of the strategy," he said. "We are an oil and gas company."
During the first few months of 2020, as you will all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed everything. Responding to the health crisis and the human tragedy that has unfolded has rightly become the central priority of governments and societies. The year 2020 has taken on a new significance as a year of stark choice. We're still facing a climate emergency, and the decisions we make now will determine whether we can bend the emissions curve and will affect the future of humanity and of our planet for thousands of years. Christiana Figueres, the former UN climate chief, said that recovery packages to rescue the global economy could rise as high as $20 trillion over the next 18 months. And she added that whether investments are channeled into high carbon industries or towards clean technologies is the most important decision we will make about the climate crisis. Now, as we've said already, the Quakers in Britain, the Church of Ireland, and the United Reformed Church are leading the way on divestment, having made commitments to full divestment from fossil fuels. This table comes from our report, and since our report was published, a third Catholic diocese has divested from fossil fuels, but there are 22 Catholic dioceses in England and Wales, and so far, no Catholic diocese in Scotland have divested, so there's certainly further to go. In some church denominations, such as the Church in Wales, Scottish Episcopal Church, and the Church of Scotland, church bodies have recommended divestment from fossil fuels for ethical reasons, and these recommendations should be followed through as a matter of urgency.
The Church of England's General Synod voted in July 2018 to begin divestment in 2020 from oil and gas companies that are not taking seriously their responsibilities to assist with the transition to a low carbon economy, and to complete divestment by 2023 from companies that are not aligned with the Paris Agreement targets. Yet, with all major oil companies planning to significantly increase fossil fuel production in the next decade, when global carbon emissions must halve by 2030, as we said earlier, can we really consider any of these companies to be taking their responsibilities seriously?
In 2017, as you can see in this photo, the Methodist Conference voted for the Central Finance Board of the Methodist Church to divest from oil and gas companies whose business investment plans are not aligned with the Paris Agreement targets by 2020. Now, on a positive note, the Central Finance Board announced last week that it had divested from BP and Total. However, it also said that it would continue investing in 4 oil and gas companies: Shell, Repsol, a Spanish oil company, Eni, an Italian oil company, and Equinor, a Norwegian oil company. Based on the research that we've outlined in our report, as well as research from groups such as Carbon Tracker and the Transition Pathway Initiative, none of these oil companies are aligned with the Paris targets, and the Methodist Church should divest from all fossil fuel companies now.
Okay, so we're into the final section of the report. Again, please feel free to continue using the Q&A box to send us any questions you have on anything you've heard so far. So just to say, finally, divestment from fossil fuels is an important practical response that churches and other organizations are taking in response to the climate emergency. This enables churches to use their prophetic voice and speak out with integrity on the climate crisis. By ceasing to invest in organizations that are fueling the climate crisis, and by doing so publicly, the divestment movement seeks to remove the social license of fossil fuel companies to continue exploring for new fossil fuel reserves when the vast majority of known reserves must remain in the ground. Even the oil companies themselves are acknowledging that divestment works. In Shell's annual report for 2018, there's a quote that says, "Some groups are pressuring certain investors to divest their investments in fossil fuel companies. If this were to continue, it could have a material adverse effect on the price of our securities and our ability to access equity capital markets. In other words, divestment makes it more expensive for oil and gas companies to raise capital for new exploration and extraction projects."
The former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, has highlighted that while cuts to investment in oil and gas companies are beginning to take place in the financial sector, the process is not moving fast enough. Last December, he once again warned of the increasing risk to investors in fossil fuels being left with worthless or stranded assets, as Martin mentioned earlier. As well as divestment from fossil fuels, investment in clean alternatives is vital to accelerate the transition to a zero carbon economy. Mark Carney has said that such new technology investments and long-term infrastructure projects need to be financed at quadruple the current rate. There are examples of churches that are leading the way in this area. For example, since divesting from fossil fuels, Quakers in Britain has also invested in renewable energy and energy efficiency. By divesting from fossil fuels and investing in the clean technologies of the future, churches can continue to provide the moral, financial, and prophetic leadership that is needed at this key moment in history.
So we'll end our discussion of the report with this quote from Dr. Rowan Williams, former Archbishop of Canterbury. He said, "Divestment will send a positive and hopeful message to the people of this country and to those in vulnerable communities across the globe who will be most immediately affected by climate-related disasters." Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we're going to now hand back over